Good afternoon, all. Hope everyone's having a great day. So, today I want to welcome you to the session titled Protecting Your Software Startup. This talk will go for about 30 minutes and includes some question time at the end. So, let's jump straight in. My name is Luca Gnezda. I've been in the tech industry for about 22 years now. I began my career as a software developer and gradually over the years expanded through a variety of roles: tech leadership, design, architecture, and business strategy. So nowadays, I tend to provide services to a mix of businesses of all sizes, strategic leadership usually at the larger end, and product establishment, tech team lead, and scale up for digital startups. So over the last 5 years, I've done this through a pair of businesses that I run, Taptu and Head Full of Heart. So I've been a startup and I've experienced firsthand what it's like to be on the other side of this fence.
So today I've debranded the whole slide deck for everyone's benefit. I don't want this to be a sales pitch. I want this to be an education piece. It's also going to be very slide content heavy, and the reason why I chose to do that is so that people could watch this offline at a later date and go through the content freely. By all means, feel free to record, share the links that Hub Adelaide provide, discuss and debate with your peers. It's through discussion and debate that we really can move some of these conversations forward. So what's my motivation here? So I really would love to see an Australia with a rich and thriving tech sector, something that builds the next generation and strives for a better, more capable future. And to be honest, I'm sick of seeing these scenarios where my peers in the startup community are exploited for the gain of others in the market. So I decided to apply my experiences and just try to raise a bit of awareness. So let me start with the basic pitch for today. So people with bad motivations lead to bad behavior. Bad behaviors then lead to bad outcomes, and bad outcomes are the things that kill your software startups. So the goal for today is to try to avoid badness. So let's just talk about the scenario a little bit here. So I'll start by introducing the two key groups of actors here. So we have startup founders, people who are largely dreamers, ideators, visionaries. They're looking forward and they're possibility and future centric. They're really not geared up as threat centric people. And that's a good thing. That's necessary to really create and drive the world forward. Then you've got providers and experts, and they come in all shapes, sizes, and motivations. The great ones will spend a large proportion of their energy teaching, empowering, enabling, and accelerating any businesses that they work with. The bad ones use very different tactics, try to create lock-in conditions, try to take shortcuts to delivery to accentuate profit, and potentially in some scenarios actually leech IP away from startups themselves. So the problem statement. The invention of software has very different challenges and risks than things in the physical world. It's often tempting to try to equate a lot of what we do digitally to the physical world, and analogies are great, but there are subtle differences that really matter, and knowing and understanding those differences go a long way to actually mitigating problems. So at its heart, your vision is your product, which is your software, which is the code that you build and how you deploy that to particular hosts. Now, it's hard to protect, it's hard to patent and defend, and it's really easy to copy and recreate. And that is the opportunity for bad actors. So it's really easy to potentially exploit inexperienced software startup founders. And when they do, bad things can happen. So let me give you some context and a bit of a scenario. So being a startup founder, and I know because I've been here, is really a story of feast and famine. Okay, so generally there's a very rich landscape in business leadership. Not always true, but often people go and create businesses and actually have a sense of the dream that they want to create, and the ways to do it. Technical leadership is the interesting one. Is one of the interesting ones. That has a spectrum from very rich, where the founders are technologists themselves, through to poor, where they're not. The vision is usually rich, and that's the whole basis for a startup. Cash is usually poor, at least in comparison to the vision. And that's one of the key challenges in surviving the first formative years of any business. And then there's capability and capacity, which typically ranges anything from moderate through to poor. And that's largely because you're cash constrained and you're people constrained. So for anyone who's on the left-hand side of those spectrums, the story's not so bad. But if you're on the right side of either of those two, they're the scenarios that we really need to look at risk mitigations, because that's where exploitation can happen. So it's also a story of capability and capacity here. So to create software or great software, it needs multiple people operating in different headspaces, and they're all important. It's really hard to be great at a lot of these things, or even more than one of them often. Development is very detail driven. Design is very big picture. Strategy and architecture is big picture. Operations is detail. Quality is kind of a mix of some of these things, and each one requires a very different attitude and headspace. And context switching across these headspaces is tricky, and that's actually part of the problem. So for a startup that's cash poor, it means that it's tempting to try to apply one person to multiple things, and that often creates difficulty moving forward. So because of that, startups more often than not need to lean on the capability of others through the formative stages of projects, even if their founders are tech experienced. And again, speaking from first-hand experience on that one. So let me introduce you to Alice and Bob. So Alice and Bob have this amazing software startup idea. Both of them are subject matter experts and in their chosen market. Both are very entrepreneurial in nature. One of them is tech savvy, and so they kind of know some of the basics on how to move this thing forward. But neither of them have actually been in large scale commercial construction of software, and that's kind of important. So what they do is they go, right, we need a bit of help. We can't afford to employ people full-time or long-term because we're not sure that the startup will land. And so what we want to do is augment our capabilities with someone else or some other people. And so what they do is they look for help and they meet Chuck. So let's meet Chuck. So Chuck's an account exec, and he's either in a local tech, software, or creative agency business. And he's a pretty smooth operator. He's been around the traps. He's sort of technical, at least enough that he can use quite effective buzzwords. He loves the thrill of the chase, and he loves making money. Now, Chuck and his managing director actually have aspirations of selling their own software. And so they like to see startups and see what they're doing. Often the best ideas come from the community around you. So it's tempting for them to make observations and draw connections between their clients and their own business. So to them, a client is really a challenging piece of work, but also a means to their own end. Now, so Chuck explains his team, his business. He explains that they've got this secret technology source which makes development faster, cheaper, more effective than any of their competitors, which is great. Because in a cash poor frame, then you've got to be careful with how you move forward, and you want to try and get best bang for buck. Now, even better, Chuck's business is going to look after the geeky stuff, like the software repos, the CI/CD, which is the pipeline to get software onto whatever hosting you've chosen. But that's okay, because they're still going to deploy the final product to Alice and Bob's chosen cloud hosting provider. And so Alice and Bob love this. They know enough about the tech. They've been around the traps. They can watch from the sidelines and let experts do their expert thing. So they sign an NDA, an IP agreement with Chuck. They explain their idea. Things are going well. They then sign a development contract with Chuck to then construct, to design and construct the first pieces of the problem. And it all goes horribly, horribly wrong. Now I'm speaking about Alice and Bob, but I'm speaking about real human beings that I've witnessed and my peers have witnessed in the community. So it's not as hypothetical as it sounds. So the next question is why? What went wrong? It seemed like it was such a good idea. So I wanted to give you my suggested top 8. If you can just walk away with the headlines of each of the next 8 slides, you'll be at least on a better footing moving forward. So number 1, it's actually really hard to detect the Chuck. How do you tell the difference? Because most vendors are actually quite honest, capable people. They don't go in to destroy the world. But there are Chucks, and so it's hard to tell them apart. They're usually really good at spin. They're good at concealing their motivations. And so the only real way to know if you're talking to a good actor or a bad actor is to know as much as they do, to understand the very lingo that they're using. Now, what that means is that either you need to bring along someone who does understand it deeply, and can be your advocate, or you need to do the hard yards and actually learn what all the geeky stuff means and learn it in depth. Now that's actually, it might sound like that's hard, but actually if you're in a tech startup and you want to actually be there for the long haul, knowing this stuff in depth is really important. So the other tip here would be to use the ability that you have in entrepreneurism and leadership to try to tease out the motivations for any vendor or any supplier that you're trying to engage. What is bringing them to the table? Now, often you can do that subtly and silently in quite discreet ways. And at some point, everybody has a tell. And what you want to do is look for those tells. Because if you can separate the difference between someone that's trying to make money from you at all cost and someone that's trying to create a great outcome, and while they're doing so, make a little bit of money, then you can be in a much better place. Number 2, there's no secret sauce. I don't care what anybody says. There's no secret sauce, and the reason for that is that our industry collectively learns and shares what it does. At its foundation, the people on the ground, the technical people, are creatives. They want to build and they want to share. And so foundational patterns, approaches, and accelerators are generally already in the public domain. The value is how you apply those patterns, approaches, and accelerators to your specific scenario. So the secret sauce is nothing other than intelligence and experience in those patterns, approaches, and accelerators. If your product is reliant on third-party IP, right? So if someone is giving you a secret source or letting you use their secret source, that's their IP, and that means your solution is not truly yours, and that's super important to distinguish. So great providers will give their accelerators to you freely, and they'll contribute freely to public domain. So you want to be wary of anyone who tries to peddle your secret source, which sounds contrary to what you would expect. So ownership of code and pipeline is key. So your product is your software. Your software is your code. Your code lives in repositories. Okay, so your code and your repositories are the heart of your IP and your product. The development lifecycle, the decision processes, the code histories, the commit histories, the comments that go with the code, that's all the accumulated technical knowledge of your product. And your pipeline, the way you get code from your repositories into your cloud hosting and your devices, is then the third bit. So any startup must own all three at all times. Anything else is a recipe for disaster, because if you take away any one of those pillars, someone else owns the IP, not your business, regardless of what you've written on a piece of paper. And yes, you can argue, you can litigate, you can do all these things, but in practice, what we see when this stuff goes wrong in the ecosystem around us is that by the time someone is trying to defend their IP, they're already very cash poor, and the supplier is actually in a much stronger position than they are. And ultimately, legal defense requires money. Number 4. Highly skilled, disciplined people are key. So, software development is a creative process. It continuously learns and adapts and responds, which makes it really hard to cost and harder to resource. And that makes it difficult to manage. So it is tempting to offload the whole problem to someone else, and sometimes you have to in the formative stages. But no matter what you offload, they need to be highly skilled and disciplined people. They can't be hacks. They can't be pretenders. If you do so, you will end up with nothing to show for it at the other end. So you want to be skeptical of anyone who tells you that this is easy. Anyone who makes bold promises, tells you not to worry, that they've got things under control. That is code for we're trying to make you feel good so you look the other way. Because this stuff is hard, it's supposed to be hard. So they should be telling you just how hard it is, and you should be making the hard decisions right beside them, right with them. You also want to be skeptical of anyone that doesn't actively encourage you to build out your own team and doesn't put you in the driver's seat of when the handover from them to your business occurs. You are in control of that. You need to stay in control of that. Anything else, it tends to lead to the permanent establishment of dependence between you and the supplier. Forward planning and delivery milestones. This sounds super simple because we do it every day in large-scale business projects, in any industry. You plan projects and products, but you'd be surprised how often it doesn't occur in a software startup, because the goal is to get to the end as fast and as cheaply as you can, and so you try to take shortcuts. This is not a shortcut that you make. So forward planning defines the outcomes, and that allows you to assess in-flight performance, and milestones give you discrete breakpoints. They're like control valves, things that let you swap out vendors and suppliers if they're underperforming for your needs. So you want to be really skeptical of anyone who doesn't start by collaboratively defining a forward plan, that doesn't say that says that the problem can't be decomposed and they have to do the whole thing end to end, and someone that tries to provide an all-in-one encompassing quote. because it's just often not possible for the type of software that really we're trying to deploy out into the world. Good software is expensive. So pretty much take any number that you can think of and you can multiply it by 5 or 10 times easily. Because what you'll find is that there is subtlety in the problem, and that subtlety does not propagate out until you're well within the design and the agile life cycle. And that's what agile is all about. It's trying to react to the things that traditional waterfall projects never could, which means that there will be delta, there will be optimization, there will be decisions that you make that you change. And so you should be really skeptical of anyone who makes software sound really cheap and doable with any arbitrary budget that you set. I can't tell you how many times we see customers come to us and they say, oh, we engaged vendor X. We said, what could you build for $50,000? And they said, oh, we could build it all. Don't worry, we'll have it under control. We've got 10% of what we wanted and we've burnt through $75,000. How much do you think this will actually cost? And by the time we get to the end of a design phase, the numbers sometimes, you know, 300, 400, 500, 100,000 by the time you get to the end, because visions are big. And so you really want to, so numbers tend to accumulate quite quickly. What you want will change, which is the addendum to that last point. That whatever you describe today will be an oversimplification. And this means that you need to expect rework. So anyone who doesn't incorporate some kind of control and budget and allowance for that change is actually not doing you an appropriate service. Because what it means is that if you make any decision, if any decision is wrong, and we all are human, we all make decisions and they're wrong at some time in our life, then that will cost money. And if you're already at the limit of your budget, then there's going to be problems. And then finally, don't avoid uncomfortable truths. So all of this sounds like it's just getting in the way of a good time. And often you'll get people that say, oh, it's all too hard, I might just give up. Or even worse, they take this cavalier attitude, it won't happen to me. But what my suggestion is that I challenge yourself to solve these issues before you begin, and then keep challenging yourself to revisit them and remain on top of them, and actually challenge whoever you engage to keep answering these questions as well. So if I just kind of wrap up, how to avoid becoming Alice and Bob. So before you seek expertise, go talk to the people who have been you in the past. Okay, there's some great examples even in our local environment and in the Australian landscape. I'm based in Adelaide, clearly, so you've got people like Team Gauge, Code 360. You've got you've got a whole bunch of these type of businesses. Go talk to them. They've been you. They know the pros and the cons, right? They know what's going to work and what's not going to work. They'll also give you a really healthy dose of skepticism as well. And they'll tell you what works and what didn't. And if you get enough of those points of view, what you can then do is distill your own strategy from that makes sense to you. Then when you seek expertise, the key points are be wary of secret source, holding your code or your pipelines, people that don't encourage planning, people that don't decompose the problem, people that don't promote building your own capacity. And definitely seek reference checks from peers and the community, and actively work at learning and deeply understanding the lingo, the methods, the approaches. If that means that you have to go and train yourself up, train yourself up. It's worth it. Before you build anything, make sure that you have the admin accounts of your software lifecycle tooling and your cloud host and your development repositories. If you can't, at a drop of a hat, log in and see everything that those developers are doing and take control of them and evict them, something's not right. Have a clear picture of what you want to build, and at least the next milestone at high resolution. Okay, if you're without that, you're not going to be able to assess performance, and you're not going to be able to sabotage if it's going wrong. Have a costed forward plan, even at a high level estimate, even if the vendor or supplier can only project a few phases in advance. That's better than nothing. And then identify your pivot point where you go, this business will work and I want to build out my own technical team, and make sure both parties understand that that will happen, and that they both understand what the transition plan is from vendor to internal team. And ultimately, avoid badness, right? There's not enough of us in this space in the Australian market. We want to be taking technology to the world. So avoid the badness, embrace the goodness, and thrive. So with that, I thank you for taking the time to listen, and I invite you to chat your questions in on the Q&A window.
Thank you for all that information, Luca. Very informative. I did have a question. So you spoke about there's no secret sauce accelerators, but clearly tech is hard. Otherwise, everyone would be doing it. So what makes it so hard?
Oh, that's a great question, Beck. So let me sort of break it down to two parts. First of all, let me demystify these accelerators. So I think, in all honesty, I think we consider ourselves to be a market leader, at least in the Adelaide space, in these domains. Okay, so we run modified branching flows based on GitLab and Gitflow. We run full pipeline automation, AppSec automation, test automation. We can cloud scaffold resources programmatically. We also have some great tweaked architectural patterns that we employ, both back end and front end. And I still don't think we have a secret sauce. So why? And that's, it goes back to the core of the problem here is that this stuff is actually mostly public domain. The progress is so fast that if we tried as an industry to hide things away from others, we wouldn't be able to make the pace of progress that we make. So a lot of content is public domain, especially when it comes to patterns and practices. Beyond this, our business shares back pretty much everything that we know through meetups that we contribute to, Medium articles that the team writes, things like Awesome AppSec, which we moderate, and so there's no need, even when you're doing all of the things right, there's no need to hide that stuff, because there's no hidden value in that. The best players are doing it, and the best players are teaching others to do it. The value is in your code. So then what is actually hard? Well, I think for me, it feels like being skilled and experienced, or having a team that is skilled and experienced, a team that doesn't take technical shortcuts, a team that is disciplined at applying product management principles and agile practices to the software lifecycle. And then, most importantly, actually being able to run that through a team of multiple high performers that harmonize well with each other. So the core of the difficulty, I think, in my mind, is humanity and the processes that the humans enact. That, if it's not right, unravels really quickly. And I think that's what prevents most businesses from really thriving, because that story is probably the hardest story to win. The actual patterns and practices and tools anyone can read up on, and given a few months of practice, can get good at it. The team harmonization is hard.
Awesome. Thank you.
That's all right.
Does anybody else have any questions? No. Well, I have one more. So what if a startup doesn't have the funds to do an expensive build well?
Yeah, okay. Good one. So I suppose I like to answer those type of questions with a question of my own. So what is the founder's time and energy worth over the next 3 years? So pretty much any startup founder is going to sink their entire life into making something work for the first 3, 4, sometimes best part of a decade. And no one wants to spend that time on something that's going to result in a product made out of cardboard and stuck together with string and flower glue. It's a waste of that immense amount of personal energy. So I think I'd always advise customers to consider both in unison. And the true cost of getting your product to market is the financial outlay plus that effort cost. And I've never really seen a startup survive properly without a substantial volume of both. So let's say money is tight, passion is high, desire to come out with the right outcome is high, but dollars are tight. So what I'd suggest in those cases is try to build less. Try to seek seed investment, or try to go slower to match whatever investment cash flow you are able to bring to the table. And then to try to prioritize outcomes that try to generate some form of business cash flow earlier so that you're less reliant on investment cash flow. But then through that, whatever you do decide to build, I'd make it high quality, adaptable, scalable, and sustainable. Because if you don't, and let's say you invest $100,000 into some software and it's not scalable and you have to throw it away, you have to spend another $100,000, but not just another $100,000, but to then build it well, more than that. And so you don't want to be working to a false economy of cheapness early. It's better to build less and to do it and to do what you do really well. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. I have a couple more questions. This one's coming from Flick. What books do you recommend for learning more about preserving IP?
That's really interesting, because I think there's a lot of sort of stories in the market, and I think different books will give you different aspects of the problem. I know that there's some pretty interesting insights that drop out of the Phoenix project, but there are a few other things out there. But actually, to be honest, there's also a lot to be learned just by consuming content online. That there's starting to get there's some resources starting to emerge around the combination of agile and product management, and talking through some of the pitfalls of that, and actually there's a lot in preserving IP just in that life cycle. If you know that life cycle well, and you know that that scope, the way that machine works, the product life cycle, the agile life cycle work, it's a lot easier to protect your IP just in that. And then the last one is people. I go back to people. Lived experience is often worth every penny. So I would probably mix all three of those resources.
Great, thanks, Luca. And I just have one last question. Any resources to help learn the tech industry in a consumable manner with someone without a tech background?
Yeah, I think what's hard here is not are there resources. I think the actual problem is that we're flooded with resources, and the tech sector is so large that it's easy to get lost. And so what I tend to suggest to a lot of actually, if I go to large scale business executive, which are a large chunk of our customers, what we find is that if you start with things like project management, things that you can understand and seed well, and then you look at resources that explain how that translates into the IT space. That's a good place to start. Having a look at lean, design thinking, agile, and those concepts, and then queuing that again from the physical world into the digital world are good resources to start with. Because the truth is, most IT things that work in this startup space don't run by a traditional project, they run by product management. That's how Microsoft and Google and all of the big players operate. So starting there, and then it's about learning the software lifecycle, I would suggest, at least to a level that you can speak to a developer in their tongue. So it doesn't mean learning a coding language. I think it means, where do you put code? What do you do with code to get it from your desktop into the cloud? What does things like CI/CD mean? Pipelines. I think they're all really good places to start. But there is a wealth of knowledge there, and so what you probably want to do through that is have someone that you trust guide you a little bit through that exercise. Ideally, someone that's not going to then become your vendor and your supplier, so that you can get a sense of independent input to guide you to some learning materials. But that said, anyone that wants to reach out after this session and ask that question in more detail, I'd be more than happy to share whatever we've got.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Luca, for joining us today. So we'll wrap it up there, and thank you to all the attendees today. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.